Hello, my name is Carl Irwin, and this is a somewhat short tutorial at taking a look at the halo material and the particle system in Blender. And I've seen, ever since I started working with Blender back when version 2.56 was coming out, and they were just implementing the smoke simulation. I read on many blogs at that time, and actually from some fairly reputable people that work with Blender, about the halo material and the particle system, and using the halo material with the particle system in order to create smoke effects. And some people would refer to the halo material as a worthless material. It didn't make any sense. It didn't have any good use, and the use that it was used for in terms of creating smoke was just lousy, and it didn't do a very good job at creating smoke and those kinds of effects. And I kind of bought into that until I started playing around with the halo material and the particle system. And then I came to realize, after putting together a few different concepts from different tutorials that I saw online, that all of that stuff that I was hearing was completely, well, it was nonsense. That actually the halo material is extremely powerful and very, very useful when rendering a lot of different things. And that, of course, using the halo material and textures with the halo material along with particle system could generate some pretty believable effects. And it actually is, these things together are quite comparable with some other very well respected proprietary particle effects for other platforms, such as Trapcode Particular for After Effects and some other rendering platforms. I learned that the halo material and the particle system in Blender was able to emulate just about anything that some of these other proprietary systems could come up with. That with a little bit of time and effort, a little bit of retooling, that you could really do anything on par with some of these other things. So I just want to show you a few examples of what I'm talking about, and just to point out that sometimes it's not worth using a smoke simulation, which takes hours and hours or days to bake and then to render, when sometimes effects can be accomplished using simple materials and textures, just as you would use Trapcode Particular to do a smoke effect for a certain situation, rather than using fume effects or something like that, something that would require considerable more bake time and rendering time. There are easier ways to accomplish some pretty significant effects, and the halo material is quite useful, and I look forward to it being implemented in some other render platforms such as Cycles. And boy, if we could see a halo material in OpenGL, that would be something to write about. I think that would be very useful. So to those of you developing minds out there that write code, these are not some of these things shouldn't be considered as sidebar as they have been, and I think that some of these things are certainly worth considering development for. And halo materials is one of them. Don't put down the halo material just yet, because I find them very useful. So let's take a look at a very just a small example that I put together really quick. Now this is just a simulation. And it's kind of a larger scale smoke effect, and I guess if you could imagine that this is like a locomotive or a train moving through the frame here, and puffing up this smoke, and as the smoke comes up it dissipates over time, and there's a little bit of turbulence, and you can see a lot of detail in here, and there's a lot of shading and shadow and all kinds of interesting things. And if you were to create something like this using the smoke simulation, it would require a great deal of time, lots of baking time, lots of render time, very big domain, in order to render this out. And this is actually created using just halo materials and textured halo materials and the particle systems, a couple of particle systems actually, in the internal Blender engine, internal Blender render engine. So let's take a quick look at how this is done. Now this is rendered at 50% resolution, so that I could render it very quickly. Each frame rendered at about a second or 2 seconds at 50%, 1280, 720, so half that resolution. I'm going to render out some full frames here so you can take a look and see a little bit better what some of the detail looks like. If I jump to the end here, let me enable everything very quickly and just render very quickly one frame. Let this render out. It'll take just a few seconds, probably about 5-6 seconds here, and we'll see what we get. And if you look at this, you can see that there is an awful lot of detail in this. If we zoom in nice and close, you can see a lot of cloud texture going on here, and a lot of shading. You can see that there is clearly some shadow going on in here. And if you know anything about the halo material, you know that it is not really possible to create shadows using the halo material. That there is a shading function, but it refers to the way light interacts with the halo material and not really the way it casts shadows. Well, there are some really simple tricks that you can use to create shadow and also to create some randomization in cloud texture using the halo material and texturing the halo material. And we're going to take a look at a few of those things. Now, some of you may have messed around with the halo material in the past, and you put together a particle system and put a halo material on it. Maybe you even textured it with a cloud texture, and when you rendered it out, you realized that the results were fairly, well, they were fairly lousy because the texture does not rotate using halo materials. The texture stays in the same position for every single halo, and it doesn't look very good. And of course, when you do that, you get bad results, and then you jump on. Some of you may have jumped on some of those blogs and in frustration, put up messages concerning how bad the particle system is, and how bad the halo material is, and how difficult it is to get anything that looks good. Well, I want to point out that you're selling, if you've ever done that, if you've been in that situation, you're probably selling short the probably best and most proper use of the particle system. The best use of the particle system in Blender is to use multiple particle systems for one effect, in that you can create one particle system with one texture and layer up several textures with different seeds and come out with a very sophisticated effect. So let's look at what's going on here. And it doesn't, before you get the idea that this takes a lot of work, it does not take very much work at all. It's actually quite simple to do this. What I did is I put one vertice on and I parented it to a empty here. And this is very important. Whenever you're starting with a complex particle system effect using halo materials, you should parent your particle generator to an empty. And the reason for that is so that you can easily duplicate that particle system in that empty without having to constantly parent things together and line them up. Okay, so the first thing you should do is create an empty, put your vertice parented to that empty, and then you can work from there much more easily. So I'm not going to go over the settings of this particle system here. If you can take a look at it, clearly there's zero gravity, and I have a few forces set up in the particle system that cause the particles to move up in the z-axis. I have what's called the Brownian. If we take a look at this very quickly, in the physics settings, I have the Brownian force set kind of high to 5, and the Brownian force is what causes the particles to kind of quiver and mingle around and move around after they've been emitted. I have some drag and some dampening enabled on this, so the particles emit on the z-axis up, and then they dampen and they kind of hover in this plane space where they kind of mingle around with these Brownian forces. So that's essentially actually the particle system settings right there, zero gravity. Now again, you do whatever you want with this, and it's very important that you get your particle system to move the way you want it to before you start messing around with texturing. Start with the points first and make sure the points are moving the way you want them to, and then move on to the texturing phase. But make sure you get your simulation correct before you move on. That'll save you a lot of headache later on. So I've only enabled the very first particle system, and this one has, I believe, about 500 particles that are emitting over the course of 250 frames. And let's just quickly render this to see. Let me go to the last frame and render it. You can see what this looks like. Now, as this renders, you'll see that actually just this one system looks pretty good, really. It's very similar to what you would find in After Effects and Trapcode Particular if you were looking at the cloudlet function. In fact, the halo material is very much like the cloudlet material in Particular, with the exception that cloudlets can cast shadows and halos cannot. And you may be wondering, well, where is this shadow coming from? How is this accomplished? Well, what I've done is I've created a halo material on this vertice, and let's go to those settings very quickly. And they're set kind of small to 0.2. I've enabled texture, extreme alpha, shaded, and soft. This one here, shaded, this refers to how light affects it, but it doesn't cause shadows. It does not cast any shadows either on the particles themselves or on any other surface. What it does is it causes light to illuminate them, the particles. So the closer the particles come to light, the more illuminated they would be. In fact, you could even color the light, and the colored light would affect the color of the particles. So that's what this does. The option we're most interested in is this one here, the texture option. We're going to enable that. And what this allows us to do is go to the texturing slot, and the first slot in the texturing option here, whatever material, or rather texture we put in here, will be used as the texture for each individual halo. So what we did is I added a blend texture, and you can see it's just a grayscale gradient. It's light on the right hand side, darker on the left. I put in a few kind of sub points in here to get this so it's really dark down here in this and really light over here, and I set it to vertical. Now you can see that we can change this. I can move it to horizontal so it goes dark from the left to light on the right. We can even flip this by hitting the F. It'll flip it the other direction. But what we want is we want it vertical so that there's a light part on the top and a dark part on the bottom. Now when this renders, if we go back to that frame we just rendered, you can see that each individual halo now has this gradient. So what we've done is we've emulated, or we've simulated rather, shadow on the bottom side of each one of these halos. And you can see as they interact with each other in space that you can see kind of this puffiness occurring, because we're seeing some of these halos that are closer to the top. We see their gradient near the bottom before the next halo occurs underneath it, and that causes this kind of three-dimensional relief to occur. And this already looks pretty good. It's missing detail, but you could probably get away with this in a certain scene if you rendered this out and it wasn't the main focus of attention. This would probably be pretty passable. So even right now we're well on our way. Now some of you may be wondering, you may not be familiar with the particle system in Blender. How is it that we're able to make these to increase in size and also to fade away gradually? Because particles in Blender, particularly the halo material particles, they have a tendency to just disappear very abruptly whenever their lifetime ends. Now this is accomplished also using the other slots in the texture. Now the halo material will automatically take the first texture and make that the visible texture of the material, as long as you have it enabled to do so. You have the color enabled. You can also enable the alpha, and it will use whatever alpha coordinates you have in here and make those parts transparent. But the following slots can be used to cause the particles to increase or decrease in size, or to fade away or increase in alpha opacity or transparency. And let's take a look at the very bottom one here, the third one that I have on here. You can see that there is a blend material, and on the left there's a white color, and the white color is set to let me select it very quickly. The white color select a 0.5 alpha to start with, so it's already somewhat transparent, and the one on the far right is set to 0 alpha transparency. And below that, underneath the coordinates, instead of having this set to generated, which is the default, I have it set to strand particle. Now what this will do is it will cause this texture to affect the particle over its lifetime, so that over its lifetime it will start at 0.5 opacity, and then will gradually, until it's the end of its lifetime, will move to 0.0 opacity, causing it to fade out as it will decay with time, so to speak. And we have it, the alpha enabled, and we have it set to multiply, so it overrides all other alpha that may be on it. Now if we take a look at the middle texture, this texture looks like there's nothing there, but if we look at the first point, it is set to alpha 0, and then the second point, which is white, is set to alpha 0.01, very low number, but this is going to affect the size of the halo particle. Okay, and the reason why it needs to be kind of a low increment is because 1, if we set this alpha to 1, it uses the alpha channel to determine the size, not the color, which is kind of funny. I think that's a little strange, but it does use the alpha to determine this. If this alpha was set to 1, the halo would fill the frame. Okay, so we don't want it to go to 1. We want a low increment so it doesn't get any bigger than what we have here. So it's a little bit of trial and error to figure out what these sizes should be. And again, this will affect it, as long as we set the coordinates to strand particle, will affect it over time. Okay, so that's how we do this. Now on some other proprietary programs, instead of using a gradient or an alpha gradient, I guess you would say, to affect these things, there would be a graph. So the higher the point on the graph, the more influence, and the lower the point, the less influence, and so on. Blender just uses gradients rather than graphs. So it's the same concept, it's just that we're using a gradient or an alpha gradient instead of a graph. Okay? And there's some other things that you can affect as well. Hardness, you can affect the hardness over time, color, alpha, the ability to add the texture to itself. Halos can add upon themselves and cause them to increase in brightness and intensity. And of course you can change the blending modes for all of these as well. So anyway, very, very important functions that you may not have previously been aware of. So far we've created this image, which is mimicking a light source, even though there is none. We've faked it, adding a texture to it. Now we want to add some detail. So here's what we're going to do. What we do is we take this particle system and we're going to duplicate it. So if we hit Shift D, it will duplicate the particle system again. If we hit Escape, it will keep it parented to the this empty that we have here, and it will have all of the same settings that we had before. Now I'm going to delete it because I've already done this. Let me hit X real quick. Actually, before I do that, let's take a look at some of these settings real quick. Look at the material of this one that we just created. You can see here that the material has a number 2 here, and what that means is that there are 2 items in here that are using the same material. Now if I want this to be independent from the other one so I can change the settings without affecting it, I would click on that 2 and it would create a new material that I can now change the settings to without affecting the first material in the first particle system. I can do the same thing with the texture slot. If I look at the first texture, see it says that 2 are using this texture. If I click that, it makes a new texture. It's the same one, but now I can change these settings without affecting the first one. If I go to the particle system, you can see it says that there are 2 items using the same particle system. If I click on that, it will create a new particle system with the same settings, and I can change these settings now without affecting the first one. So that's what we're going to do. Each time that we duplicate, we're going to click that so we can create a new instance and change those settings. Okay, let me delete this one because we don't need it. And let's look at the ones that we've added. So here's the second one that I added, and the first thing you can see is that I changed the material. I set the alpha to 0, and remember, you have to isolate it from the other material before you make changes, because you don't want to affect the first material. We go to the texture slot, and I replace this blend texture with a cloud texture. And on the cloud texture, I set a gradient so that the white is completely opaque and the darker spots is completely transparent. So we have this alpha enabled cloud texture. I set it to hard, so we get a little bit more of a harder cloud texture. I increase the depth so there's more detail, and I increase the size quite a bit. I also enabled alpha on this texture so that the alpha transparency will affect the texture. We'll be able to see through those parts that are transparent, and the color. And I also, on the material size, I increased the size a little bit. Okay, so it's a little bit bigger than the halos that are in the first texture. For the particles, I decreased the particle count significantly. There are only 50 particles in this particle system. You can see there's quite a few less. And I also changed the seed. So I bumped the seed up to 1 so that the particles are being emitted in very different locations from the first particle system. And we can see what this looks like now that we have it enabled. Let me render a frame very quickly, and we'll see what that looks like. Now you can see as I added this cloud texture, and you can see each one of these halos has the exact same cloud texture, and that's a problem because there's too much repetition. And that's not good. We don't want that. That looks unnatural. We're going to do something about that. And part of the reason why we only have 50 particles is going to help us with that, because we're going to add some others that have a different texture. But you can see already this starts to look better. This texture is interacting with this other texture underneath, which has a shade on the bottom. And the interaction of this white and transparent cloud texture is adding detail to our smoke simulation. Okay, so let's say that we duplicate this again. Let me enable the second one, and we go to the material, and we would click on that too so we can separate it. And I would increase the size by a little bit from the first one. And then on the texture, we're going to leave everything the same, but I want to click on the 2 to isolate this from the first one, because we're going to change one setting here. Down here where it says offset, and on the X, I'm going to change this from 0 to 1. And what this means is it's going to take the sample that we're using for our cloud texture and move it over by 1 unit on the X-axis. So we're taking a different spot in this cloud texture to use for these particular particles. Okay, so we're changing the cloud texture slightly by moving it over, by offsetting it. Now we go to the particle system, and I would click on the 2 to isolate this particle system. We're going to leave everything the same, but I'm going to increase the seed again to 2. So these particles do not emit, if you look here, these particles do not emit to the same points as these 50 particles. They are in different spots, and that's very important because we want these to interact with each other and not be in the same location. So now that I have these enabled, let's render this again and see what we get. You'll see that the detail becomes more intricate because now I've got 2 separate cloud textures interacting with each other, completely different cloud textures, and it causes it to look more random. There's less uniformity and less reoccurrence of the same texture. And you can see all of these fading textures are still there. It's affecting all of these particle systems as well. Very, very much more intricate. And because it's slightly bigger than the other particles, some of this detail stands out on the edges, and that's very, very important. Halos render in 3D space, so halos can be inside of other halos. So you can look through a texture on one halo and see another one underneath, filling out kind of volumetric like. Even though if the camera were to move, our view of the halo never changes. Now when we have many different halos together, we don't notice that as much. It's kind of hidden in the crowd, so to speak. But it still does render in a volumetric way in 3D space. Okay, so already this is looking really, really good compared to what we started with. And what we started with was already pretty good. Let's go back here. We're going to duplicate this again. Again, we're going to isolate the material, set it slightly bigger, and we're going to isolate the first texture, the cloud texture, and this time instead of offsetting only on the x-axis one, we're going to also offset on y. So we have x, y, and z that we can use here. We can do many different versions and variations of this, and we can use different numbers and whatever. We have quite an infinite number of capability here, an infinite capability to get different cloud textures on these vertices, on these particles. Again, I'm going to go to the particle system and I will isolate it and change the seed again. So these particles are different from these particles, which are different from these particles, and then this is our main shaded particle system. Okay, and one other thing you might want to do is change the lifetime. So on my last particle system, I have the lifetime set to 250. On the second one, it's 225. On the first one, it's 200, and on the main one, it is 200. So some of these particles will last a little bit longer and tail off on the end, so that it causes a little bit more of an interesting interaction as they fade out at the very end. So you want to add this detail, and really, it only takes a couple of seconds to kind of tweak around these settings and come up with what you want. So now we have all of our particles systems enabled, and if we render this now, this is the final product that we come up with. And again, this is at full resolution. Takes probably about 10 seconds to render at this point with all of these textures enabled and with it at full resolution. And you can see this is pretty darn good. I mean, this looks pretty realistic. If you had this composited within a scene and there's other things going on in there, this would be very believable, very passable. And the amount of time that it would take to render it, and particularly the amount of time it would take to test render it, just to prove your concept before you commit to a full render, would be infinitely, well, it would be exponentially smaller than it would be to render a large-scale smoke simulation. So sometimes the halo particles are the way to go. I think these are very much underrated, and I would encourage many of you out there to experiment more with the halo materials and the particle system, and come up with easier and quicker ways to create some of these smoke effects and lots of other effects as well using these materials and the particle system. One other quick note about this before I hang this up is that you can also affect solids in the particle system, but not using this material slot. In terms of changing the size and opacity and all these other things. What you have to do if you're going to use a solid, like an icosphere or a cube or something like that, rather than a halo particle, what you have to do is click on the particle system settings first and then click on the texture, and it gives you a separate texture slot that applies only to the particle system. And from here you can create a texture, a blend texture, and it gives you some other options affecting particles. And if you look here, influence, general, time, lifetime, density, size, physics, velocity, dampening, gravity, force fields. You can affect all of these elements in your particle system with gradients and other textures. And that's a very, very, very powerful tool that maybe you may not have been aware of. And I encourage you to experiment with that. The Blender particle system is really quite powerful. And I just want to point out that oftentimes it's easy to confuse something that is very complex with something that is too simple. if that makes sense. So by looking at this and thinking that this is very complex, you may come to the conclusion that it can't do what you want it to do, when really, because it's complex, it's actually quite powerful. And because it's powerful, you can really do anything you want. It just takes some time and it takes some experimentation. So again, I hope that many of you can find a new lease on life for the Halo material and the particle system in Blender, and I hope that you can find a way to make this work in some of your projects. So one more idea. You could render these out with alpha transparency as just image sequences, and I've done this before. So you render out a bunch of elements, smoke elements, and then you can place these in your scenes as image planes, and use those kind of like using a card or a billboard in another 3D program, sometimes referred to as cards or billboards. You can do that and get just the same impact. And this is an even better trick. If you do that, you can actually shine light through those cards or billboards, and it will cause shadowing to occur inside of your scene, because remember, halos do not cause shadow within a scene. So in order to get the shadow, you can render out these elements as a billboard and then shine light through it, and you can get shadow. So that's another trick that I've learned, using these halos to make elements and then still get shadow within your scene. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the day, for those of you that are programmers out there, I'm looking for the day where we can get halos to show up in OpenGL. Some of you may know that I'm a kind of a fanatic about the OpenGL rendering, and I would love to see the halos appear in the OpenGL capability in Blender. I think that would be very, very useful. So crossing my fingers, maybe someday we'll be able to do that. Anyway, I hope you find this useful and enjoyable, and good luck in your projects, and I wish all of you happy blending.